Hey, my name is Rowan Smith and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare and conquer your upcoming hike, trek or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for. Let's get into today's episode.
Alright, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are talking all about returning to your training after being sick. Now, the reason why I want to talk about this today is this is a hot topic at the moment. We've had so many people reach out to us about, just coming back from some type of illness, whether it's a cold, whether it's an infection, whether it's, something a little bit more serious like COVID or whatever it may be, and just asking for, what they should be doing with their training as they're getting back into things. So today I thought I'd give a bit of an outline around a few strategies we use for our hikers to give them some guidelines when they're coming back from any type of illness. Now, to be really, really clear, take this advice with a grain of salt. Obviously, this isn't medical advice. Obviously, doctor's advice always going to trump what I say here. And obviously, everyone's going to be in a very different situation because putting sickness and illness under one big blanket or a couple of big blankets, obviously, it doesn't really compute so well. So this is just sort of general strategies which you can apply into your own situation, which hopefully will give you a little bit of extra direction. Now, the ironic thing here is I actually planned to do this podcast last week, had it all planned out, but then I got sick myself. So hopefully today will be all good and I won't be coughing down the microphone or anything like that. But essentially, when we're talking about returning from being sick, now in normal situation, if we're just sort of training, hiking day to day, we get sick, not really a huge big deal. We can have a bit of time off, we can sort of ease ourselves back into things and that's absolutely fine. But where this does get a bit more stressful is when we do have something on the calendar that we are preparing for, whether it's an overnight hike coming up, a multi-day adventure, or a big thing you've been training for months, and all of a sudden you get sick. It can be really, really, really stressful. And the number one mistake I do see from hikers in these situations is just coming back too fast, too soon after they've been crook. And they just jump right back in the deep end. They start pushing themselves and they get really tired. They sort of have lingering symptoms from the illness. And it just sort of ends up being a big kerfuffle. And it's sort of that type of thing where 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it just drags out for a long time. So essentially, if you can be, I typically like to be a little bit more conservative when you are coming back from illness to give yourself that time to really properly recover and really make sure the body is feeling good and great before you actually ramp things up again. So as a really, really, really brief overview of our immune system and immune response and how exercise actually affects that is exercise directly affects our immune response, both in the short term and also the long term as well. Now, when we're talking about the short term, so something that happens over the next 24 to 72 hours after training, essentially moderate or light intensity exercise can actually boost our immune function. So things like gentle walking, cycling, swimming, really, really simple, light, moderate exercise can actually be beneficial for the immune response. However, in the short term, higher intensity exercise, heavy strength training, or long duration, sort of more difficult exercise can interfere with our immune function in the short term. So this is basically a response from the body. When we do something a bit more strenuous, our immune response just has a little bit of a dip for 24, 72 hours, depending on the certain exercise you've been doing, which in a normal situation when we're healthy, not that big a deal. It's just a standard consequence of training. But if we're coming back from illness, obviously that's not a particularly great thing. If our immune response is dipping when we're probably still, going through a recovery process, we don't really want to be dealing with this. So a general rule of thumb is when we are returning from illness, we kind of want to give a bit of a buffer zone between, okay, we've been lying in bed, sitting on the couch, doing absolutely nothing. we want to sort of give a bit of a buffer zone between that and before you actually get into anything a little bit more higher intensity. And we essentially want to fill that buffer zone with sort of lower intensity, moderate exercise. So you're still doing something, you're still slowly returning to training, but you're not really pushing things so much that it's going to put you at risk of going backwards. So really, really simple rule of thumb, and it's not rocket science, but it does need to be said. Now, basically, there's kind of two different situations in regards to returning from illness, which I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about something that's casual, that's normal, that's pretty stock standard, and there's something that's a little bit more major, a little bit more serious. Like obviously not a major medical emergency or anything like that, because that's a whole different story, but something that is, it's a little bit more than just a common cold. So when we are talking about the really simple stuff, so you've had a cold, you had a sore throat, maybe you have an ear infection or something like that, something that, it's been uncomfortable, you have been definitely sick, but it hasn't been the worst thing in the world. A really, really, really simple rule of thumb for this type of thing is to take the number of days that you were actually sick and then use the equivalent amount of days after you've been sick to ramp yourself up with lower intensity exercise before you get back to normal training. So for example, if you were sick for 5 days and you were, just not doing anything for 5 days, taking it super easy, and then you start to feel a bit better and ready to get up into things after 5 days, then a really easy rule of thumb is to take 5 days after that of just doing low and moderate intensity training before you actually get back to what you're doing before. So this might involve just doing some walks around the neighborhood. It might involve doing some swimming, some cycling. It might involve doing some pack walking with a really light pack if that's something you've already been doing. Might be involved doing some gentle strength trainings and some body weight stuff or some light weights or whatever it may be. And do sort of the equivalent amount of days there and then ramp back up to where you were. Now, for some people, this may be way too conservative and you might feel after a couple of days, you know what, I'm all good. For some people, they may have to extend this out a little bit more. Or whatever it may be, everyone's in a different situation, but this is a good starting point of just saying equivalent amount of days, take that. Now, a lot of people will sort of get impatient with this, and I would say look, if you just do 1 or 2 days of this and you are feeling good, if you are feeling like ramping it up, just do a little half step up and see how that goes. And so if you have been doing your sort of casual walking, maybe introduce a light or moderate pack. See how that goes. If that goes fine, then take it a little half step up again, and then a little half step up, as opposed to just going from 0 to, where you were. Again, sometimes it can be a little bit too much too soon. But that's a really, really simple rule of thumb if you've been dealing with something, a little bit more casual. Now, when we're looking at something that's been a little bit more major, so, obviously a lot of people recently have been going through things like COVID or going through things like, respiratory infections or whatever it may be. I'm obviously not talking about specific conditions here, but when there's something a little bit more major, so it's not just a normal cold or whatever it may be. Essentially, in this situation, as we're returning to training, I typically like to use a bit more of an extended return to training. Now, you probably can shortcut this and accelerate this. And again, everyone's going to be different situations, different places. But I like to use a bit of a 3-week runway if someone has had something a little bit more serious to ease them back into kind of where they were before. And by taking these 3 weeks and taking it very, very slowly and intentionally, that really gives the body plenty of time to recover, gives us plenty of time to bounce back with our energy, to sort of get used to things and sort of keep us moving forward. And so it's not a rush. It sort of reduces the risk of just doing too much too soon and just feeling absolutely gross. So if you are coming back from something a little bit more major, the approach I kind of like to take is in the first week of returning to exercise. So essentially, once you're feeling, ready to do something, and you're feeling ready to get into things, the first week of that is super, super, super easy. So basically, all that involves doing some unloaded walking, maybe some gentle cycling, maybe some gentle swimming, maybe just doing a few squats, a few glute bridges here and there, without any weight. Really, really, really simple. And the intention here is never really get you huffed and puffed, never really get you sort of sweating, but it's just a gentle exercise for 7 days. Now, some people, they may be tempted to push it, but if in this situation, if you're coming back for something a bit more major, just take it easy. 7 days, very, very gentle exercise. And essentially, you slowly just want to do, as you start to feel a little bit better, as opposed to doing harder exercise, you just do a little bit more. So for example, if you were doing a 20-minute walk yesterday and you woke up the next day and you're like, you know what, I've actually got quite a bit more energy, maybe just do a 25 or a 30-minute walk the next day. And if you wake up the next day feeling good, maybe do a 40-minute walk and so forth. Or if you wake up and you're like, oh, you know what, I'm knackered, then take it back down to a 20-minute walk. Just play around with that. So essentially, you're not messing around with intensity in this week, but you're just sort of, doing a little bit more, but very, very gentle stuff. So that's week 1, 7 days of that. Really, really simple. Now, week 2, as you're coming out of that, essentially here, we kind of want to ramp things up very, very, very slightly. So we want to put a little bit extra intensity in. But again, it's not that case of you getting super huffed and puffed of really pushing things or whatever it may be. This is still very, very moderate. So in this situation, you might go from, okay, if you're just doing casual walking the week before on the flat, maybe you'll just start to introduce a few hills on your casual walks. Or maybe you might just put a slightly loaded pack. Or if you were doing strength training before, maybe you're just doing, a few exercises here and there. Maybe you might string together a 30 or 40-minute session with strength exercises, but they're very, very simple. They're very, very light. They're not difficult. They're not strenuous, but you kind of go in through the motions and go in through the exercises. And you do that for another 7 days. So slightly higher intensity, slightly more difficult, but you're still never really finishing anything where you're like, I'm knackered, I'm exhausted, I'm huffed and puffed, I'm sweating away, or anything like that. So that's week 2. Then week 3, essentially that's when we start to ramp things up and we start testing out the sessions we were doing previously before you actually got sick. So you might go ramp back up to your pack weight that you were doing previously and do those for a few walks, see how you go. Or if you're doing stair sessions, you might give those a go and just see how you feel. If you were doing sort of interval sessions, you might sort of do a few of the intervals and just see how it feels and slowly ramp back into those intensities and those sessions you were doing and just do a bit of trial and error and see how it goes. If you do something and it feels good and you wake up the next day feeling fine, then happy days, that's a big tick. If you do something and it doesn't feel good, then, you wake up the next day and you're like, oh, I'm a bit knackered. Then you're like, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll give it another couple of weeks before I get back into that. And just test everything out and see how you go and sort of get that really good knowledge around what's feeling good. And for your strength stuff, you can probably start doing your normal strength sessions here. And again, just sort of see what feels good. And essentially, if that all goes fine, then in week 4 from there, then you just get back into your normal training. Just go back to your normal programming, normal intensities, and by then, hopefully, you should be feeling pretty good. Or alternatively, at any stage, if you sort of get to the end of any of these weeks and you're like, oh, you know what, I'm still not feeling good, just extend that week out another 7 days. So if you got to the end of the first week and you're like, oh, you know what, I'm still really struggling with just this casual walking, do that for 2 weeks before ramping things up or whatever it may be. Again, everyone's going to be in different situations, but this is a nice rule of thumb. And essentially, I find with that sort of 3-week runway, typically people tend to get a bit restless before the end of that, and it can be, a little bit long. But I often find this sort of conservative approach, particularly for hiking, it can just be a nice way of just making sure we're taking step by step, making sure we're not doing too much too soon, and I particularly like it. So if you are coming back from some type of illness, whether it's simple, whether it's something a little bit more, whatever it may be, exercise, getting back into exercise is going to be an important part of your journey at some stage. But the important thing is just not just jump right back into the deep end. Ease yourself back in, take it step by step, respect the body's recovery process, respect you getting back into it, and slowly get yourself where you go. And if you come in with a plan with this type of thing, it can be a much, much more positive experience instead of just doing a willy-nilly, just doing too much and then feeling really bad about yourself and beating yourself up. But if you take into this sort of step-by-step plan on the mental side of things, it definitely can work as well. Now, again, I will say, from all of this, obviously everyone is different situations, different illnesses, different sort of places. Some people will be much, much longer journeys if they're coming through something a bit more major again. Some people might be able to bounce back quicker or whatever it may be. Obviously, you take this with a grain of salt, chat with your doctor, get some insight from that. But hopefully this gives you some rough guidelines, which may be able to help you, as you're coming back from some type of general illness. So I really do hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I hope it gives a few people a bit of insight, some strategies, and something to keep in their back pocket for when they need it next time. I really do hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope they've gotten something out of it. And aside from that, I think that's enough on this topic. So I hope you have a lovely day, and we'll talk to you very, very soon.